So, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session on ambiguity and participatory processes. And, well, first of all, before we start, I'd like to thank the PNS community for having us here and all the patients and good organizations they have had and the patients they have had with us. And my name is Marcela Brugnach, and I'm a multidisciplinary scientist. I work at BC3, that is the Basque Center for Climate Change. And here we are with my two colleagues, Caroline van Bers, who is a researcher from the University of Osnabrück, and Violeta Cabello, who is a researcher now at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, but soon to be in BC3 too. And what have joined us to come to this community, to this session is, well, you already know Violeta, that is very much part in your group. But for both Caroline and I, this has been a new venture. And we are here also representing TIAS, that is the Integrated Assessment Society, which is a society that deals with integrated assessment and participatory processes at the core. And for both Caroline and I, we have been working together for the last 2 decades, I would say. And part of our research, a core part of the research, has been collaborations and participatory processes. And even though we cannot frame that in the context of PNS, they have a lot of similarities. And so in this endeavor of joining our efforts and bringing TIAS into the picture, we decided to organize the session. And if it works well, maybe we can have a broader session on these issues for next year. And well, we have a program I wanted to share with you for today. Can you see it? Can you see it now?
Yeah, we see the program, but we don't see very well your face, Marcela. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, that's okay.
Because you are right against the window, and I don't know if you can turn easily if it's not too much.
So then I can change this my view. Let's see if I can do that. But meanwhile, just look at the program, which is more important than my face. And so here we thought in this session as a very interactive session in which we have, is it better now?
Yeah.
Okay. So in which we have 2 parts. One, we are going to address issues of ambiguities in participatory processes through the 3 talks that some of you have already seen it in YouTube. If not, we are going to do some recap today. And then after that, after the 3 talks, we are going to have a 5 minutes or a short, at least, Q&A. As I was saying, in the Q&A here, we are thinking in addressing just very briefly what was expressed in the talks, more for clarifications. And the whole idea is then to move in part 2 to the coffee corner and have a moderated discussions in which we address more in-depth issues of ambiguities, and we bring our practices into that. Our purpose here is to share, so we all share our experiences and about this issue, and to try to find out ways of moving forward, or at least how we are aware of all this. And since we come from different fields, it would be very nice. This is a very nice opportunity to share how we have been addressing and coping with ambiguities. So I will start now with a little bit to recap my talk for those of you that have not seen it. And well, one of the things that we are coming now from the point of view of complex theory and with integrated assessments, complexity, participatory processes. And in the lingo of, we are dealing particularly with natural resource problems and sustainability. And in the lingo of post-normal sciences, we are also dealing with problems that are high in stakes, that are very uncertain, with values in dispute, and that are very urgent. And one of the things that characterize these problems is that they all are associated with people. They all involve people, and by involving people, involves relationships, and involve social relationships, and involve political relationships among them. And when you have multiple people around the table, it's unavoidable that you have multiple ways of different ways of understanding and interpreting the same situations, and multiple ways of framing the same situation. And so in this context, ambiguities are something that emerge because the encounter of multiple frames that are incompatible or not in agreement will result in these ambiguities. And ambiguities has been defined as a different sort of uncertainties, indicating a degree of confusion that result from the existence of too many interpretations. And one thing that is important to know why issues of ambiguities are important are because depending on how problems are defined is what type of knowledge we find to be relevant, what is uncertain, and what are the solutions we are going to seek for these problems. I work with issues of water and with underground water, and a typical situation is that you have, this is a common pool resource, and a typical situation is that you have in problems of, it's an issues of water scarcity, and in this situation you can have, farmers can frame this as an insufficient water supply. Environmentalists could say that this is a problem of excessive water consumptions, while river basin authorities could be saying that is the problem of illegal water abstractions. So these are the environments in which we have to work on and in which we have to make decisions and devise new policies. But ambiguities are not something negative. Ambiguities is something very desirable, something that we actually want. Because ambiguity speaks for diversity. We don't want, it would be boring, life would be very boring if we all are the same. So, and complex realities cannot be reduced to one coherent frame. But also, ambiguities could be, as we have seen already in some of the talks previously, that ambiguities could be challenging and problematic and a source of conflict, and also can bring a lot of inequalities and social injustice. So the question, and this is what I will finish with, is that it's not so much of, it's not a question of reducing ambiguities, but it's a question of how we address them in contexts where that are complex, and where multiple people with different values, frames, backgrounds, expertise are included. And part of it is to ask questions and to be reflective about who is included or excluded, under which role and conditions actors participate, how much influence or authority are actors granted to their participations, how do actors interact with each other, how do they talk about, what do they talk about, or what they don't talk about, how do they communicate, how they position themselves, what are their expectations, assumptions, and what are the barriers of communications, distrust, misperceptions, stereotyping that exist among actors, or how do actors view the systems at large. And we have to remember that all these questions, all these questions are asked in an environment, in a setting where there are power differentials, where there are very different access to resources, where there are issues of identities, where there could be conflicts and history of conflicts that needs to be solved. So this is, in a nutshell, some of the ideas I think are important for the discussions that will come. And now I will leave the voice to Caroline, who will address this from her experience in European projects in natural resources, particularly dealing with the nexus. So thank you.
Thank you, Marcela. So I'm sharing my screen now. Bear with me for one moment. So my name is Caroline van Bers. I'm from the Integrated Assessment Society, as well as the Institute of Environmental Systems Research at Osnabrück University in Germany. And today I'll present ambiguities in the context of integrated assessment, looking at experiences from stakeholder processes in the management of the water, energy, food nexus. We're focusing here on river basins where both ecological and societal issues, of course, interconnected as they are everywhere, and that they're dynamic, they're complex. And in the case of river basins, they're often transboundary and certainly always transdisciplinary and cross-sectoral in nature if you're trying to address them in an integrated way. So to address these issues and identify solutions, the type of cooperation that's needed is often international. It's interdisciplinary, of course, and intersectoral. And it's a process that needs to be managed to a greater or lesser extent. Ambiguity and uncertainty are an inherent part at the outset of such a process. And they are considered to be elements to be overcome usually. But also, as Marcela pointed out, also a source of creativity. In the case of river basin management, often three main sectors are involved. That's water, energy, and food production in this case. Within a basin, there are also distinct regions with different functions and interests. For example, upstream versus downstream. In our studies, it is often hydropower upstream and food production downstream. Another example is urbanization versus rural development, where there are distinct priorities between those two forces. In planning and implementing participatory processes that involve a number of sectors and disciplines, such as we see in the Nexus, we try to achieve a level of mutual trust among those who are involved to strengthen the relationships among the stakeholders in such a way that learning can take place and their perspectives can be broadened and in some cases changed. And I'm sure many of you have had this experience yourself when you've been engaging stakeholders. The goal of the process is to achieve more effective communication across sectors and disciplines and try to achieve an initial step towards a common understanding and hopefully reduce ambiguity and uncertainty to the extent that solutions and acceptable trade-offs can be found. So I'm focusing today on just one project. It's a project that's been running for the last 4 years. Our institute is responsible for the stakeholder engagement side of the project. And it's an EU Horizon 2020 project entitled Decision Analytic Framework to Explore the WEF Nexus in Complex Transboundary Water Resources Systems in Fast-Growing Developing Countries. And the overall objective is to establish a decision framework that can be used by stakeholders and eventually decision makers to support the management of the natural resources that are involved to support them that they move in a sustainable direction. We've used an integrated water resources management approach to address the WEF nexus in the project and are focusing on two basins, the Omo-Turkana and the Zambezi basins in Africa. The Omo runs from northern Ethiopia to the south of the country and empties into Lake Turkana in Kenya. The Zambezi River, as most of you know, is in southern Africa, runs through 7 countries from Namibia in the west to Mozambique in the east, where it empties into the Indian Ocean. The approach has involved a lot of quantification and analysis of the WEF nexus, working with stakeholders to identify the trade-offs between the potentially conflicting objectives, such as what I mentioned earlier, power production versus irrigation and land exploitation versus conservation. Just two examples. These are the Daphne partners. I won't go through the whole list because of time, but the project is coordinated by ETH Zurich in Switzerland. And we have a number of partners we have 5 partners in Africa and 9 in Europe. And what you see on the left is an image of the Omo, and on the right, the Zambezi. So the project team leading the participatory process, and of course it wasn't just us involved in that, but we had quite a few partners, including the African partners involved. Our goal was to facilitate and lead and contribute to an understanding of the effects of and trade-offs that are associated with the management of the WEF nexus in these regions, and provide stakeholders with a way of analyzing the different decision pathways. And we developed what was called a negotiation simulation lab, which was created as an environment to support stakeholders in sharing their different perspectives and cooperating in the hope that they can identify potential pathways to sustainable resource management in the river basins. And indeed, that is what they did over the course of 4 years. NSL means negotiation. Diverse stakeholders meet openly to discuss issues and potential solutions. Stakeholders, simulation means stakeholders mimic a real-life deliberative process with other actors who have diverse interests and backgrounds. And a lab, which is basically an open environment created as a safe learning space. There's nothing particularly laboratory-like about it. We used neutral venues such as hotels for our meetings. So we tried to reduce ambiguity and misunderstandings in the following ways. First, we identified and defined issues at different geographic scales in what you would call multi-sectoral groups. So bringing the different sectors together, water, energy, and food, but then at the sub-basin level, so often at the country level first, and then bringing those groups together in a collective deliberation at the basin level. We also promoted visualization of issues and a more holistic understanding of basin priorities through joint activities, as you can see in the photograph there. This is a mapping exercise. We also, in the project, developed computer-based visualization tools by EIPCM in Berlin, who was responsible for that. And these tools facilitated deliberation and created a sense of collaboration for achieving a shared understanding and hopefully ultimately developing solutions. So another way of reducing ambiguity is to keep the same language and terminology. This is always a challenge when you're engaging stakeholders, not only from different countries and regions, but also from different sectors and disciplines. So we try and keep a consistent vocabulary, phraseology, and make sure that we clarify expressions that may not be familiar to the other participants. And involving partners who can speak across sectors and disciplines is important. So this is why our case study partners in the African countries were very important. They're often key in, of course, contacting the various groups and stakeholders who are involved. Okay, and then in order to maintain a level of clarity and understanding, common understanding over the long term, even after the project ends, and it is about to end at the end of October, we particularly focused on developing a stakeholder network or community of practice to maintain the project after its end. This is more likely to evolve if there is an existing basin-wide regional platform or network that can take it on. For example, we've identified the Zambezi Watercourse Commission in Southern Africa to take over our tools and hopefully maintain the network. Those we're still in discussion with them about that, but we hope that will take place. Visualization, information platforms, and other tools can be put into the hands of the community practice, but of course it needs to be supported by training and resources. And this should be planned well in advance. So throughout the project, we have involved the stakeholders both in developing the tools and in using them. So you see a hands-on session taking place in the photograph here. Okay, this is my final slide. We, in order to assess the learning process and ultimately to identify if there were misunderstandings or if the approach and the tools that we developed weren't clear in some way, we undertook a pre and post NSL survey. So that means before meetings and after meetings, every meeting. We undertook these surveys among the participants of the meetings. So you see some quotes here that suggest that it's fairly representative of the responses we had, and in particular, the stakeholders from other sectors, from different sectors, pointed out that they learned a lot about the perspectives of their colleagues working in another sector, and also what their priorities are. So in that sense, we felt that it was successful, and we hope that that this collaboration will continue after the project ends and we leave and carry on with our next projects. So thank you very much. And there will be time for questions later on, of course. But I'll hand over now to Violeta, who will present on narratives in the MAGIC project. Thank you.
Okay, hey, hello. I'm afraid the PowerPoint didn't work very well, Caroline, so I hope it works better with mine. Otherwise, we'll try to find a solution. I'm sharing my screen. Yeah, okay, so I think it's working. At least I see full screen, so I move on. Hi, I'm Violeta Cabello. I've been working within the MAGIC project that has a very strong presence in this conference for the last 4 years. And in this presentation, I'm trying to connect so the work that we have been doing with this framework of ambiguities of Marcela. And in particular, I will talk about how we have used narratives as an analytical tool to work with ambiguities in participatory research processes. So narratives are just one way of many possible to analyze ambiguities in the sense of different framings, in the sense of different ways of knowing. In MAGIC, we use these very nice definitions from Thomas, who was presenting yesterday, and we analyze how different people story their views about particular issues by sequencing events, by placing subjects in them, and by connecting or establishing causal connections between problems and solutions. So the whole idea of MAGIC was to use narratives, a narrative analysis to generate critical discussions on policies and innovations that are relevant from a welfare, water, food, and energy nexus perspective. I was very involved in a case study that assessed an innovation, which was the use of reclaimed wastewater for irrigation in the Canary Islands in Spain, which is an arid context with a very intense touristic and agricultural activity that has driven freshwater degradation over the years. So we were interested in analyzing how people understood the role of reclaimed wastewater in the context of agricultural and water governance. And we studied one area that where there was a new project of reclamation. So farmers were still relying mostly on groundwater, and there was this new technology coming up, and we wanted to see to understand what was happening and what people were thinking about that. So how did we do that? First, we started with a round of interviews with mostly experts from water, food, and energy domains, and we asked them, so what are the issues? So why do we need reclaimed water now? So what problems is this technology trying to address? And then we also survey farmers on one side to collect their views, and on the other to collect quantitative data so we could analyze and make a diagnosis of the situation with regards to types of farming systems. And then we spend a significant amount of time like processing all that information, and especially establishing connection between qualitative and quantitative data. This is very important in the magic approach that I didn't mention, is quantitative storytelling. And all that information, we used it for a final workshop. And I think that workshop was the core of the whole process of co-creation of knowledge. So in the interviews, we already found like differences, no? And this is why I think it fits with ambiguities. So while the main promoters of reclaimed water, that were public authorities, frame the innovations as a means to alleviate groundwater overdraft and sectoral competition, we had other actors and powerful actors that were questioning the overdraft idea and say it's only about sectoral competition, it's only about continuing agricultural and touristic development. No? And still we had others like researchers and activists who like to look at things from a more system perspective, and they were saying like, well, this is just like a patch to a more complex situation now. And among the farmers, we found some of them who were in favor of using reclaimed water, and some others who were against the use of reclaimed water. And it was very interesting that they were using the arguments about the characteristics, price and quality, especially of reclaimed water, right in opposite ways. So the quality is worse than groundwater versus it's better, and the price is cheaper versus it's more expensive. So we say, this is very interesting. Let's try to explore this more. And we focus our quantitative analysis. I don't have the time to go into this, but into exploring. So who is for, who is against, what type of farming system, why they might be in this position. And then we organized the workshop. And in the workshop, we started with a tour. So we went to the field with more than 30 people. They were mostly technicians from the water, from agricultural administrations. They were researchers, consultants. And we first visited the wastewater treatment plant, and then we visited a farmer who was for using reclaimed water, and then another one who was against. So it was a way of having their narratives alive, no? And I think this was very important because they added very relevant information. And afterwards, we presented the results from our research, and we say, well, this that we just saw in the field, we have also observed in our interviews, and then we organized a discussion group that was 3 different discussion groups with 3 different scenarios, but they were focused precisely on those differences. So we were assessing the viability and desirability of the technology, focusing on the aspects in which we had found different framings of different positions. So the outcomes of all this process, there are many, but I would like to highlight that I think we contributed to improve the perception about the use of reclaimed water mostly, despite our as researchers, a skeptical position with technofixes. I think that this idea of having narratives in the field was very useful because they provided information that addressed some of the uncertainties that people were using and sustaining their positions. No? And in the end, we found a very strong convergence. So everybody was enthusiastic about the use of reclaimed water, no matter what happened in the world. And I think that part of this, and I want to connect this with Marcela's presentation, was that the representation of different positions was not even. So most people were already in favor. Those who attended the workshop were already in favor of reclaimed water, while critical voices were minor. And I think this is important because if you want to have a discussion about a polarized situation, you need to balance that better. However, we managed to have a very interesting discussion about constraints to the technology, about the context of and about the role that they play. And I think this, in the end, enriched the knowledge that came out of the process. So some learnings to wrap up. I think, in my view, narratives were very helpful for understanding ambiguities and use them for reflexive assessment. Procedural aspects matter. So who comes and what power relations do they have, and how they represent a position. It is important, and it's very difficult because sometimes you invite people and they simply don't want to come. We invited relevant actors who did not want to attend, and that's an issue. And be aware of your narrative. So we're not neutral observers and facilitators of the thing. You know, we were there with our skeptical view, and we were, like playing those different roles, and we had a part. And in trying to amplify pluralism, so we were emphasizing there are different positions. You know, we have ambiguities here, but in the end, most people there agreed. And this question of whether we're trying to force dissent. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Violeta. Thank you, Caroline. So I guess you correct me. There are no questions, and we can move on to the corner.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone has a question right now, or.
So we go to part 2 then. I can upload the program.
Yeah.
So this is what we are going to do. We will have these moderated discussions addressing these 4 questions. I mean, if you would like to participate, we would love to have you there in that interactive session. So see you then in the corner in a couple of minutes.
Wait, we have one question.
Yes.
And if it, no questions. So the question from Roger Kiles is, does diversity necessarily lead to better outcomes instead of more conflict? Shouldn't we question the whole concept of pluralism and diversity itself?
I like that question. Can I take it?
Of course.
Well, definitely diversity. It's how I have my approach to diversity. I think that diversity, it's a good thing to have. I mean, we need to think in inclusive processes. I work in issues of water, and the type of solutions we find to problems are very technocratic. So we are pretty much focusing in new technologies, in efficiency, in getting it better. We build better dikes, we have better irrigation systems. We compensate lacks of water by bringing water from another place. And in doing so, we simplify a lot our view of the system. And also, all these technologies also bring culture into that, brings a way of doing, and it brings of being. And so we get very, very narrow. And in these simplifications, we don't see that there is a counter side into that. We bring water we bring water to another place, and then we have to deal with a lot of water that is contaminated. We build dikes, or we have a hydropower, but people have to move we have to translocate people to another place, so we have, and etc. and etc. We lose this complexity of the system. So yes, diversity. In this world, we are all interconnected and interdependent. So these are things are at the base of collaborative, 2 principles at the base of collaborative processes. So we should not miss that, because then we enter into issues of inequity and into issues of social injustice, because some people get actually deleted, erased from the system. I always tell my students, and what happened, I mean, we tend to think to have a single perspective on problems. But what happened if you are, for example, if you are dealing with a river, what happened if you are a fish? How do you have voice, and who represents you, and how do you survive in a system that is not ready for you to have, it doesn't matter your habitat. So I don't know if I answered that question.
Yeah, thank you, Marcela. So we have a couple of more questions and a comment from Jerry that I will, Jerome Rabin said I will read, that if the task is in one way the opposite of science, which needs a single solution to a defined problem, here it is to gain acquiescence in a policy. So then there are two, someone else was saying better outcomes for whom. And there is one question about the narratives and another from Marta to me. So I will address them now. The questions from Arjen is, how do you determine what's part of a single narrative, or when things should be separate narratives? For instance, going for big but multifaceted narratives covering the stories of many, or a large set of more narrowly focused narratives that covers maybe one or two actors, and who steers that clustering? This is a very good question, and I only participated in this case study, so I only have our own experience. That might be different for other magic case studies. We did this very quickly. So basically, it was how we separated the narratives was first by the type of actor, and second whether they agree or not on what was the role of reclaimed water. But I don't have like a systematic learning on how to do that. So maybe others in magic that are here can comment also in the chat or later. Then I know it was Bruna, sorry. So how did this, she's asking me, how did this experience affect or change me as a researcher and perhaps as a person? This is a very deep question. I think that mostly I connect with a lot of learning and how I felt during the process. I think it changed the way I see the role of engagement in participatory processes. And I think it also changed the way of seeing my own role in those processes. And I asked Carrie yesterday about this idea of being the researcher and the facilitator at the same time. It is difficult to be part and pretending to be neutral. So on that, I'm still reflecting on how to do things in the future. There is a question about have you considered applying ideas from nonviolent communication? Thank you very much. I am trained in nonviolent communication and I try to use it when I facilitate. I think it's a very useful tool. And I don't know if Marcela or Caroline have experience with that, and then I will move on with other comments, okay?
I want to add that to the nonviolent communication. I think that the base of all this, we are here talking about how to facilitate processes. We are talking about relational processes. And in order to do that, communication and dialogue become fundamental. So, and how to, not only how to communicate and how to listen. And part of how to listen and how to be able to deal with different. I think this is one learning point we all have to do in this process is how do we learn to cope with this difference and to accept differences. And we also talk about maybe not reaching consensus, but how we cope with those discrepancies, dissonances, or contradictions that may be always present there. And for that, yes, you need nonviolent communication. You need dialogue and you need listening. So I'm all for working for peace in that sense.
Okay, thank you. I will read one question from Mario, and maybe you can address that, Caroline. Did you try to explain the factors determining the coexistence of multiple perceptions of the same political issue? See the plurality of perspectives within a larger picture of the whole set of interactions.
Yes, thank you for that question, Mario, and of course it's a good one. In the case of the project I described, Daphne, we were dealing with transboundary resources, use of resources. So of course there are political aspects that are very sensitive. And I have to say this was one of the more challenging projects I've ever worked in terms of that we had to be very careful what we said in certain circumstances. Plus we, as outsiders, as Europeans, are in less of a position to go in and make judgments, or certainly not make judgments, but even to put the problem in a broader perspective. So we had to leave a lot of that to our African partners who are familiar with the basin and the issues. And certainly we tried to, in our exercises, we tried to address the plurality of perspectives on an issue which was often political, without forcing any views on anyone. But we just tried to broaden it out so that people could see things from the perspective of the people on the other side of the border, in another region, in another sector. And I think based on the comments we had from stakeholders, the feedback that we had from them, there was some success in that area. And really the social connections that developed between stakeholders, for example, between Ethiopia and Kenya, were, in our view, very positive. So, it's this lack of being able to speak to one another face to face and to address issues in a neutral, safe environment that prevents us from developing solutions in the first place and leads to deadlocks in some cases. I don't know if that answers the question. I mean, I think it deserves more attention, but I'll leave it at that for now. Maybe someone else wants to comment on it, Marcela or Violeta.
No, I wanted to move on with some other comments because otherwise we won't have time for the interactive part. And but maybe Marcela, do you want to add something?
I would like to add to the comments of Bruna, Marta, and Jorge.
Yeah.
And maybe then we can move on to the other.
Yeah, because I think we are entering in a conversation about this. Same here.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I am commenting with what Marta said, that there is an institutional gap, that we need participatory methods, but we are not trained in using them, because participation is about facilitation and mediations, and we and academics are not trained to do so. And while Bruna responds that there is an empty space filled by PR professionals, and I would say that, and Jorge says that there are good experience from Nordic countries, and I would say that I would agree with Jorge that first, this is a thing that we need to train young professionals into having these abilities. It has to be part of our training programs and our educational programs, I think. And in my own experience, also in teaching 10 years in a technical university in the Netherlands in issues of water, where students are completely technical trained, but participation in issues of participation and stakeholder collaborations in the Netherlands are very strong, has been very strongly developed. And we trained our students a lot into that. Even though education, it's very, very, very technical, there is an increase, particularly in the last 3-4 years, with a lot of emphasis in what stakeholders, working with the stakeholder is. Just a comment.
Yeah, just to follow up, up to now, I think I followed 6 years of training in facilitation. So it's almost a PhD. And yeah, but coming to magic, and I'm having issues with mixing the two roles. And even if I can do it, I think I think it's not transparent, because as a researcher, you have a lot of power. You have the knowledge, so we need to be careful. And in the future, I think if I play the role of the researcher, I will invite another external colleague, probably a professional, because there are excellent professionals, facilitators and mediators out there. So so I will keep that separated. And if I facilitate, I will not say a word of my research. That's for sure. And so we have one more question to Marcela. That is, in studying how the ambiguity is addressed during the participatory processes, I wonder if you could give some details of methodologies or examples you might use to evaluate social perceptions when addressing scientific uncertainties and the social construction of knowledge.
Well, I have this, when I started working with this issue, and we linked this with issues of uncertainties. We started in working with water. We wanted to know in river basin management, we wanted to have a dialogue with various stakeholders, with different various within various river basins in Europe. And we were concerned about the importance of uncertainties. What were the main uncertainties they were experiencing? And it was super interesting, because it's we were just going to all what was unpredictable and all these quantification things and etc. And then when we were talking with them, we found that some of them did not care much. And some others, I mean, we started digging issues. I mean, they were not so much concerned about what they didn't know, but they were concerned about what they knew differently. They started the whole thing, for example, and this is in the Guadiana groundwater, they started just going directly into, in the Guadiana was interesting, because they first call us and says, well, we wanted to know how much water do we have, groundwater, how much water there is, and so we have the exact regulations, and we need to control it. We need to know how much water farmers are abstracting. There was at the time a lot of illegal abstractions that the River Basin Authority did not know. And so we started, so it was an issue of uncertainties in connections to how much water. This is a typical example in water, how much or what quality. We just focused into these two characteristics. And then when we start talking with various stakeholders, I mean, the issue had nothing to do with how much water. The issue was that, okay, regarding of why, I mean, water has been privatized, and it used to be, how water has been made public. It used to be private. It was to be my water. I'm not considered illegal. I am an illegal farmer. I have the right to water. This is a problem of bad administrations. This is a problem of too much abstractions. This is a problem of lack of water. So how we elicit all that was talking through dialogue, talking with the stakeholders. And we had some, in that case, we follow some formal methods and a formal structure we have in mind in order to do these dialogues. These were not, were semi-open interviews, or we did focus groups, but by talking to them, and by talking to them in a context of trust, and by following that process. So we never get to work on the uncertainty, but what we did was we facilitated processes. Well, I hope I have answered.
Yeah, I think there is a conversation going on in the chat, and maybe it's better that we can speak to each other. So we have the last half an hour of the session in the session space. I think it's in the coffee corner. Correct me if I'm wrong, please. So we can continue the talk. Okay, so thank you so much for your in-depth comments and questions, and maybe and we move to the other place, which is Sessions Coffee Corner.